You're welcome to another interesting civic education class with me, Subahat. The theme of our lesson today is democracy, and the topic we'll be looking at is election and voter responsibilities, part 1. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain the following terms: election, voter, and voting, differentiate between various types of elections, and enumerate the qualifications for elections. Elections have been seen as one of the most legitimate ways of choosing or selecting leaders to represent the interests of the people in government. This is because elections give the people the opportunity to choose the leaders or people that will govern them or represent them in government. Elections are usually conducted by a government-established agency which is expected to be free and independent from external interference or influence as they carry out their official duties fairly. Now, let us define some terms. They are election, voter, and voting. First, what is election? Election is a formal process of choosing a leader that will represent the interests of the people in government by voting that leader into political or public office. Elections are conducted periodically through which an individual or a group of people can get into government to represent the people's interests. This is done according to the laid down constitution of that country. For example, in Nigeria, elections are conducted every 4 years to bring in people into public offices. The government established agency that conducts election in Nigeria is known as the Independent National Electoral Commission (INEC). Who is a voter? A voter is a person that is qualified, eligible, and willing to vote during an election. This means not every member of a society or country is eligible to vote. There are certain requirements that make a person qualified to vote during an election. They include: 1. The person must be a citizen of that country. 2. The person must be 18 years and above of age. And 3. The person must have a voter's card that qualifies the person to vote during an election. Without eligible voters or qualified voters in a country, election cannot be possible. This means election cannot take place without voters. Now, what is voting? Voting is the act of expressing one's choice of a candidate during an election. Like we can see from the images on the screen, people are voting or casting their vote in favor of a particular candidate that they want to represent their interest in government. Now, let's look at some types of election. There are different types of elections. These different types of elections are conducted depending on the purpose why the election is carried out in the first place. Some types of elections are: 1. Direct election. Direct election is a type of election where citizens elect their leaders or representatives into public offices. This means citizens elect or cast their votes directly for their representatives who they want to represent their interest in government. Direct election gives citizens the opportunity to participate in politics such as election, as well as give them a sense of belonging so that they can choose representatives that will represent them in government. The second type of election we'll be looking at is indirect election. From the name, you can see that elections are carried out indirectly, unlike the previous one when we talked about direct election. Indirect election is a type of election where qualified voters select representatives who will make the final selection of leaders on their behalf. This means that citizens elect representatives that will help them make the final decision of leaders that will represent them in government. Therefore, this kind of election is done indirectly and not directly. The elected representatives who assist the citizens in making the final decisions on the leaders that will represent them in government is referred to as the Electoral College. The next type of election we'll be looking at is the by-election. A by-election is a type of election that is usually conducted to fill a vacant position where the representative has either been recalled, the person died, or the person resigned. This means that a representative who has been recalled, who resigned, or who died can be replaced by carrying out a by-election. Another type of election we'll be looking at is plebiscite election. Plebiscite election is an election where members of a country or citizens of a country show their opinion for or against a very important issue or matter in the country. For example, a plebiscite election can be conducted to seek the citizens' opinion concerning a change in the constitution or the creation of more states in a country. However, the voters do not have the final say because the legislators or the lawmakers can reject their opinion or their votes. The last type of election we'll be looking at in this class is the runoff election. A runoff election is a type of election that is conducted when a previous election has failed to give or produce a winner. This means that during an election, if two candidates have an equal number of votes, a runoff election will be conducted so as to produce a winner during that election. Now, let's take a look at qualifications for election. Every country has certain conditions that must be met before a person can participate in an electoral process. These qualifications or conditions differ for voters and candidates. For example, in Nigeria, some of these qualifications include: he or she must be a citizen. He or she must be a registered voter. He or she must be 18 years and above. He or she must not default in payment of tax. And he or she must meet the educational qualification. Now, let's begin with the qualification for voters. He or she must be a citizen. A citizen is a legal member of a society or country. Therefore, for a person to participate during an election in any country, that person must be a citizen or a legal member of that country. Thus, a non-citizen cannot vote or be voted for during an election in a country where he or she is not a citizen. Another qualification for election is that he or she must be a registered voter. What is voters registration? Voters registration is the process where all citizens qualified to vote or be voted for in an election get registered so they can participate in an election. This means that every eligible citizen who is interested in voting or being voted for during an election must participate in voters registration and be given a voters card which qualifies that person to vote during an election. He or she must be 18 years and above. In Nigeria, for a person to be eligible or qualified to vote or be voted for during an election, the person must be 18 years and above. Having seen the qualification for voters, let's take a look at the qualification for candidates. He or she must not default in the payment of tax. What is tax? Tax is a compulsory contribution by working class citizens to the government which helps the government provide basic amenities such as good roads, schools, hospitals, and so on for the general public. This means that every working class citizen of a country is expected to pay tax so that the government can provide certain social amenities that the society or the country as a whole will enjoy. Now, talking about being qualified for an election, a person or a citizen of a country who is interested in contesting for political position in a country is expected to show proof of tax payment before the person can contest for that political position. This means that a person who does not pay tax in a country cannot contest for political positions in that country. The final qualification for election we'll be looking at in this class is he or she must meet the educational qualification. Every country has different educational qualifications that they expect everyone interested in political position to have before contesting for that political position. For example, in Nigeria, the minimum educational qualification for a person who is interested in contesting for political position is the secondary school leaving certificate. This brings us to the end of this class. But before we go, let's take a quick summary on all that we've learned so far. We learned that an election is a formal process of selecting or choosing leaders to represent the people's interest in government by voting them into public office. Furthermore, we looked at a voter being a person who is qualified, registered, eligible, and willing to vote during an election. We also defined voting as the act of expressing one's choice of a candidate in an election. We also looked at some types of elections, which include direct election, indirect election, and by-election. Finally, we looked at some qualifications for elections as he or she must be a citizen, he or she must be 18 years and above, he or she must not default in the payment of tax, and he or she must be a registered voter. Now, let's take a few questions to test our knowledge on all that we've learned in this lesson. Question 1. An election where eligible voters select representatives who will make the final selection of leaders on their behalf is called option A, direct election, option B, by-election, option C, indirect election, or option D, plebiscite election. The correct answer is option C, indirect election. Question 2. Which of the following is a qualification needed for a person to vote or be voted for during an election? Option A, non-citizenship. Option B, tax evasion. Option C, non-restriction of age. Or option D, voters registration. The correct answer is option D, voters registration. I believe you can now differentiate between the different types of election and enumerate the qualifications for election. Thanks for being part of my class. I hope I see you next time. Bye.